Okay, today's lesson is Unit 2, Day 4, Greatest Common Factors. And on the first screen here, you can see the example where we have factors of 12 listed, factors of 16, and you can see down here below it says 4 is the greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor is the largest factor that both of these numbers would have in common. You can see the different factors that they have in common circled here. So factors of 12 that are the same for 12 and 16 are 1, 2, and 4. Factors of 16 that are the same are 1, 2, and 4, and the largest is 4. Okay, what is the greatest common factor for the following? So the largest factor that 12 and 18 have in common. And if you think of it, if you look at a factor sheet or look at the factors of 12 and 18, factors of 12 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. Factors of 18 are 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, and 18. And so if you look at the different factors there, the largest or the biggest factor that they both have in common is 6. So the greatest common factor of 12 and 18 would be 6. In the next example, 16, 24, and 32. Same thing. If you go through and list those factors for 16, 24, and 32 and look for the largest or the biggest number that they all have in common, you would see that it is 8. For 36 and 63, and this is a shortcut that I'll sometimes take, is I'll take the smallest number and I'll list the factors of that smallest number. So factors of 36, 1, 2, 3, 4, what else we got? 6, 9, 18, and 36. So those are factors of 36. So the greatest common factor has to come from this list of numbers here. So now if I compare these to factors of 63, or if I look to see what the largest number from this list that would divide into 63 is, 36 does not divide into 63. 18 does not divide into 63. 9 divides into 63 7 times, so the greatest common factor of 36 and 63 would be 9. 15 and 19, okay, the next example here. As you think of the factors of each of these, 15 is 1, 3, 5, and 15. 19, okay, 19, the only factors of 19 would be 1 and 19. So the greatest common factor of these two, or the only thing they have in common, is 1. The greatest common factor of x squared and x. Okay, so x squared is x times x. X is obviously just x. So the most number of x's that they both have in common, or the greatest common factor of x squared and x, would be 1x. Okay, on the next example, 20x to the 7th and 12x to the 3rd. So the greatest common factor, let's break this down into two parts. Let's look at the numbers first. Let's identify the greatest common factor of 20 and 12. So the greatest common factor of those two would be 4. And then let's look at the variables next. So we have x to the 7th and x to the 3rd. So x to the 7th, we have 7 x's. X to the 3rd, we have 3 x's. So the most x's that, or the number of x's that they both have in common is 3. So the greatest common factor would be 4x to the 3rd. And this right here, this is really what we're going to focus on today is, and here's a couple examples where this is the problem that would be given to you, and then this is what it looks like when we factor out the greatest common factor. So 25x and 15, the greatest common factor of these two terms would be 5. And so we're going to factor a 5 out of 25x and 15. So if I factor a 5 out of 25x, okay, you can think of it kind of two different ways here as you're trying to figure out what to put in the inside the parentheses, is either what's 25 divided by 5 or 5 times what is 25. And so either way, the answer would be 5. And then we also need the x. So 5 times 5x is 25x. And then 5 times what is 15? Okay, the answer would be 3. And the nice thing about factoring is that you can always check your answer by multiplying it back out. So 5 times 5x is 25x. 5 times 3 is 15. And so whatever we started with is the same thing that we would need to get for an answer when we multiply this back out. Okay, the second example, 30x squared plus 15x. So the greatest common factor of these two terms is 15x. Okay, 15x times 2x would be 30x squared. And 15x times 1 would be 15x. And here again, multiplying this out, 15x times 2x, that gives us our 30x squared. 15x times 1 is 15x. Okay, so this right here is our answer. Okay, so here's some practice problems for us. So the first example, we have 30x plus 10. So the greatest common factor of those two terms is 10. So I'm going to factor 10 out of each of those two terms. Well, 10 times 3 is 30. And since it's 30x, then it would be 10 times 3x is 30x. And then 10 times 1 gives me 10. Okay, again, 10 times 3x is 30x. 10 times 1 is 10. And the next example, 18x squared minus 72x. Okay, you can look at the two terms. So first of all, breaking it down into the numbers first and then the variables. So 18 and 72, the greatest common factor there is 18. And then each term has 1x in common. So the greatest common factor is 18x. So 18x times 1x would give us the 18x squared. And then 18x times negative 4 would give us the negative 72x. Our next example. Okay, this next one is a little bit different because our first term is negative. So we'll come back to that in a second. But first of all, factors of 20 and 12. So the greatest common factor of 20 and 12 would be 4. And then we have an x squared and an x. So the greatest common factor of these two would be 4x. And then anytime the first term is negative, we're going to factor out a negative. So instead of factoring out a 4x, we're going to factor out a negative 4x. And now to figure out what goes in parentheses, negative 4x times 5x would give us negative 20x squared. Negative 4x times a negative 3 would give us a positive 12x. And again, to double check your work, multiply it, distribute this, and see if you get what you started with. So negative 4x times 5x is negative 20x squared. Negative 4x times negative 3 would be a positive 12x. So this right here is my answer. Okay, the next example here, this is an example of factoring by grouping. Okay, so if you look at the two terms that we have here, so well, first of all, in each set of parentheses we have an x plus 4. Okay, and I want you to take a look at this. So in this first half of the problem here, this is telling us to multiply 2x times x and 2x times 4. This is negative 3 times x and negative 3 times 4. Now I want you to compare that to this. let's go through what we just learned from last unit. So to multiply these two together, we would have 2x times x and 2x times 4, which is the same thing that we did up above. And then we would have negative 3 times x and negative 3 times 4, which is the same thing we did up above as well. Okay, so this is factoring by grouping. So basically, we're going to take what's in front of the parentheses, we're going to group those two together, and then we're going to take what's inside the parentheses that they both have in common. And the only way this works is if what's inside the parentheses is exactly the same. Okay, so we'd have 2x minus 3 and x plus 4 inside the two sets of parentheses. Okay, factor out the greatest common factor and leave in factored form. Okay, so with these three terms, negative x squared plus x minus 7, the only thing that they would have in common is 1. But since the first term is negative, we're going to factor out a negative. So we factor out a negative 1. And when we factor out the negative, it's going to change each of these signs. So instead of a negative x squared, it's going to be a positive x squared. Instead of a positive x, it's going to be a negative x. And instead of a negative 7, it's going to be a positive 7. Okay, so we factored out the negative 1. Okay, and again, if we distribute the negative, we can see that we would have exactly what we started with. So negative times x squared is a negative x squared. A negative times a negative x would be a positive x. And a negative times positive 7 would be negative 7. Again, the next example, 12x to the third minus 16x squared minus 40x. Okay, the greatest common factor of 12, 16, and 40 would be 4. And then as we look at the variables, 12x to the third, so there's 3 x's here, 2 x's here, 1x in this last term. So the number of x's, or the most number of x's they all have in common is 1. So we're going to factor out a 4x. So if I factor 4x out of 12x to the third, 4 times 3 is 12. And then x times x squared would give us x to the third. 4 times negative 4 is 16. And then x times x would give us x squared. 4 times negative 10 is negative 40. And since we only need x to the first power, and we have x that we factored out, then it would just be negative 10. So basically we factored 1x out of each of those three terms. So we went from x to the third to x to the second, x to the second to x to the first, and then we had an x here. We factored that out, so now there would not be an x with the negative 10. Okay, and again, if I distribute the 4x, I should get exactly what we started with. 4x times 3x squared is 12x to the third. 4x times negative 4x is negative 16x squared. 4x times negative 10 is negative 40x. Okay, some more practice here. Negative 24x plus 12. Greatest common factor would be 12. The first term's negative, so I'm going to factor out a negative 12. When I factor negative 12 out, I would have 2x plus 1. Oops. Got ahead of myself there. So I factor out negative 12. So negative 12 times 2x is negative 24x. Negative 12 times negative 1 would be a positive 12. If I'm factoring out a negative, it's going to change the signs. Okay, the next example, 14x squared minus 42x. Okay, these two terms have a greatest common factor of 14x. So I factor out a 14x, and that would leave me with x minus 3. Okay, and again, 14x times x, 14x squared, 14x times negative 3, negative 42x. Okay, next example, negative 10x squared plus 15x. Greatest common factor of these two terms would be 5x. The first term's negative, so we're going to factor out the negative. So it'd be negative 5x that we're going to factor out. So negative 5x times 2x would give us the negative 10x squared. Negative 5x times negative 3 would give us a positive 15x. That's my answer. Okay, and then this goes back to our example we had before. Okay, if what's inside the parentheses is the same, then we would put the 4x minus 3 together, and we're going to multiply that by x minus 1. Okay, so group the 4x minus 3 and multiply that by what's inside the parentheses. Okay, last two examples here. Okay, 15x squared plus 12x minus 21. So the greatest common factor of these three terms is positive 3. So I factor out of 3. 3 times 5x squared is 15x squared. 3 times 4x is 12x. And 3 times negative 7 is negative 21. Last example, negative 8x to the third plus 7x squared minus 14x. Okay, all three of these. So if you, first of all, starting with the numbers, so 8, 7, and 14. 8, 7, and 14, they don't, there's, the only thing they have in common is 1. Okay, then the first term has x to the third, second term x squared, the last term x. So you can see all three terms have 1x in common. Since the first term is negative, we'd factor out the negative, so we're going to factor out a negative x. So when I factor out a negative x out of negative 8x to the third, so it's going to, first of all, it's going to change the negative to a positive. So it's going to be positive 8x squared. I'm taking 1x out. The next one, the next term, 7x squared. So change the sign, so it'd be negative 7x. So we factored 1x out, so it's just x to first. And then the last term, negative 14x, change the sign because we're factoring out the negative, and this would be positive 14. Okay, no x because we factored out the x. Okay, and that's our first lesson of this unit. So unit 2, day 4, and greatest common factors.